This presentation is going to be somewhat conceptual and a little theory and methods heavy today. I feel like that's not a typical caveat you'd be likely to hear before a presentation of this type. It's what you'd expect from most researchers, but I have a reputation for doing public work that is accessible to everyone in the audience, and I'm grateful for the opportunity you all have given me today to take this space to discuss topics where that wasn't my stated purpose. I didn't come here attempting to provide obscure content, but it has been rather freeing to be able to reach deeper into concepts I feel that I have to leave untouched for fear of losing that top level thread. So if it is that top level thread you are most interested in, I've embedded links throughout the slides where my previous work is relevant that will take you to some other public talks and publications. And also my information is listed for you to follow up with me, which I very much welcome and appreciate. And also you can bail like right now if this is what isn't what you wanted today, and I won't be offended if you leave at this moment. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, I can tell you that today's presentation will cover the fundamentals of embodied perception before moving into some examples of linguistic oppression in US institutions, which will set the stage for a discussion of my dissertation, which introduces a new method of sociolinguistic interview. And I'll also share some results from a perceptual experiment on Black professional speech in Detroit. All right. Language issues from living sources. The body's involvement in the creation and perception of language is indisputable. Even modalities which may be long removed from the human who created them presuppose another human's presence when we interact with them. Our human history as a species begins here with the oldest example of text. I hope that you can see my cursor circling around the image on this slide. This image is it is the oldest example of writing or language or a text or art or domesticity or community. We, and I speak for the collective body of scientists here, don't know exactly what early humans meant to convey with their hands and natural inks on this cave wall. Different scientists take many different things from this artifact. For the linguist, it is a moment preserved, uncovered in the depth of time that depicts the human ability to externalize individual thought through the body for consumption by an audience within a shared knowledge base. That's a lot of assumptions, but essentially what we can glean from this first preserved text is that this was not creativity for creativity's sake. It was communication. These symbols and others like them were employed for the purpose of marking place, establishing ownership, documenting lifeways, and conducting ritual. Each of these aspects of knowledge, which are retrievable from studying these most ancient of texts, allows us to understand something very basic about the ways in which all language necessarily operates through the body and situates the user within a given social role as one member of a larger landscape of kin and creature. So let's take some time to think about this individual user. Our senses give us the ability to perceive. So smell, touch, taste, hear, and see. And our brains partition that information into discrete, meaningful elements. We are able to determine if something is dark or light, near or far, or if we are hearing a da or a ta. This information is processed in real time. It is categorized in our minds based on all of our collective previous experience of the world. Language is never experienced in a vacuum. Remember, it issues from living sources. We always know there's a body involved, our own or someone else's, and our brains are aware of this. The meaning-making process in our minds is designed to be a relativistic and thus egocentric one. This is one reason Miles Hercules et al. Argue in their typological comparison that we see deictic expressions like north, south, adwat, down the road a piece, across the world's languages, taking up egocentric points of reference. We are at the center of our own stories, and we are actually super good at adjusting for that. So when we're giving another person directions on the phone and they are driving towards us and their there is quickly becoming our here, both parties still maintain their original frames of reference. We do that so regularly that we don't realize what a trick it is. It took years to write the code for the first space shuttle to do that. So in the center of our own stories, then, we come to adapt to the patterns around us most often, which are, first of all, our own language use, the language of our parents, our immediate communities, etc. Focusing primarily on the perception of voices, excuse me, Buchholz and Hall discuss how embodied positionality, and what we've now expanded to include this relativistic perspective, right? We aren't just a body making language, we're a body with specific ways of taking in the world. Embodied positionality is taken into account when we hear someone else because we have knowledge about the ways certain bodies are expected to behave. Why do we have that knowledge? Well, we aren't those ancient language users. We aren't stationed in the depth of time trying to communicate and make our first attempts at documenting life ever. We are right here in the present about to use some language. So we, Buchholz and Hall, are assuming that the social history of the world has occurred, and that time's arrow will continue flying forward and dragging us all along with it. And we can be confident in all that that entails. Now, I know that most of you, depending on how your settings are, can only see my head, but it is my understanding that to most observers, I am perceiving as having a female coded body. And perceiving me in this body sets expectations for the ways in which I may behave during this event. And if I confirm or violate those expectations, say if I deepen my voice like this, or I increase my volume, those actions may signal or trigger a different set of expectations in this audience listening, because I've traipsed beyond the boundaries of social role, which was initially anticipated or assigned to me. What this tells us is that in this equation for meaning we are building, body, context, and audience can be held constant, but a shift in linguistic material can significantly condition outcomes, intentionally or unintentionally, for the language user. I could use all sorts of linguistic material here to illuminate this effect, but this brief exercise is enough to demonstrate that while meaning is certainly a thing, it can be understood more of as a product of conventionality than of universal truth. When the voice emerges from a given body, its meaning will always be interpreted in context relative to the individual user. What this tells us is that no two individuals can create meaning in the same way. And by extending this reality to its furthest application, there is therefore no so-called right way to use language. This is something that is simply not definable due to the nature of embodied communication. Language use and the meaning which derives from it is, in fact, completely relative and individualized. Perhaps we can take time to marvel at the literal physics of how you have even once accomplished communication in the fact of that revelation another day. How we are even doing it right now on different continents with different sets of vowels in our heads. Languaging is absolutely a phenomenon that we do continuously and do not even recognize, but I digress. Everything we've considered, how the necessities of embodied communication tell us that arbitrary or standardized linguistic targets are unnatural, has been in a perfect world. Essentially, we've set up this equation for meaning, but we haven't yet hit play. We haven't fed any data into this system. We know that the system itself doesn't define a target for production, but ostensibly it would operate entirely equitably for all users. But we know that that is decidedly not the case. As we hit play and the social history of the world unfolds over generations of human communicative development, a preference for certain ways of languaging have been built into the ways our bodies are capable of externalizing thought. This is what linguistic oppression comes down to at its core. Across time and across communities, the ways in which most people have had open to them to use language in the world has not been entirely free. There is no moral judgment in that statement, merely an observation of environmental constraints. These patterns of oppression are incredibly old. They are older than every living human being. They are older than the printing press. And these engines which turn what Silverstein referred to as the irreducible dialectic of linguistic production and perception, are one force which has been shaping language variation and change since the beginning. As we move forward, I'm going to describe to you some examples which blatantly illustrate linguistic oppression, which demonstrate how social role and embodiment always influence the ways in which minoritized users can and do produce language. But I want to make it clear that the phenomena I am describing actually extend to all of us, that no one group is specifically guilty from what I am describing, that the examples I present are where we can most clearly see the forces at work, because in other less obviously marginalized or centralized communities, their effects are more insidious, private, and often subconscious. The big picture to frame the information I am sharing today within is that of human cognition generally, and linguistic production and perception specifically. I'm going to walk you through some specific examples from American history, which I hope will demonstrate that language standards, varieties of the powerful, writing classroom, grammar rules do not evolve out of natural language laws, but instead represent the preferred linguistic repertoire of the powerful that must be accommodated towards. Okay, so in 1705, the institution of slavery becomes officially codified in what would later become the United States. Until this point, people of all colors and nationalities traded their labor for a certain period of time, usually between 4 and 7 years, to come to the New World. This document in 1705 creates two racial classes of people from what was once a homogeneous indentured servant class already present on the continent. The white indentured servants, upon completion of their contracts, are effectively given the means to begin generating wealth. 600 pounds of grain, 1 acre of wheat can feed a family for about 2 years, about $150 in today's money, and a gun if they were a man. Blacks, on the other hand, are transferred immediately into enslavement, making their servitude contracts null and void. The 1705 document also outlines how owners are allowed to punish those that step out of line, effectively dehumanizing the Black population and removing any immorality for the killing of Black people from those who now possess them. So when you hear people say that race is a construction, this is one specific moment that can be referred to. The powers that be took a society where a social distinction by physical appearance did not exist and created the conditions to make it exist, further reinforcing those conditions by rewarding one group and presenting the other with punishment and death. By 1739, the Negro Act made it illegal to teach all enslaved Blacks how to read and successfully removed all meaningful connection to material knowledge production from the community at large for over a century. Blacks were also, of course, not citizens, a fact that should already be apparent from the treatment of the populations we are discussing, but I hope you'll permit a further linguistic observation as well, that these special codes, which detail exactly the activities available to the enslaved and those who owned them, such as allowing dismemberment as punishment, aren't the types of laws policymakers compose for people. Anyone with experience dealing with legalese going back to Hammurabi can attest to its penchant for underspecification. And I would wager, agree that these are not civil codes. They are mercantile. They are, in fact, the type of exhaustively specific codes drafted to protect market value. They define rules of engagement with a type of property, not a population of people. This is how the fledgling nation is officially managing individuals who are not citizens. Over time, many other groups of people were lumped into the category of citizen, defined still to this day in our Constitution as fair-complexioned peoples of European descent through the processes of naturalization. For this process, the Supreme Court of the United States had a list of certain ways of appearing or behaving that could be used as metrics to determine if an individual could successfully assimilate into America and become a citizen. The application of those metrics involved in the case of Yup, a man from China who claimed that he was fair-skinned enough to meet the criteria of citizen. The court rejected his claim, finding that, quote, white person does not refer to color of skin, but instead an understanding in popular speech acquired in the literature or common parlance, end quote. In the case of ex parte Shahid, they determined that Mr. Shahid, a Syrian businessman who would not have been the first of his countrymen to naturalize, was deemed, quote, browner than a walnut, end quote, and quote, so accented he could have been of no benefit to the United States, end quote. And in the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, a Hindu businessman and World War I veteran whose naturalization case was denied based on a reinterpretation of the term Caucasian. In the court's reinterpretation of that term, it was concluded that this term once included Indic peoples, but now can only scope over the, quote, lesser peoples of Europe, the Germans, Irish, and the Poles, end quote, who could be citizens because they, quote, quickly merge and lose the distinct hallmarks of their heritage, while Hindus retain the marks of ethnicity indefinitely, particularly in accent, end quote. What these anti-literacy laws and naturalization cases illustrate is that as the nation is solidifying, establishing institutions, language, race, and social role are nearly indistinguishable from each other. These aspects of self all serve as determining factors while the various populations of the United States align themselves. Black people can't even interact with language in any material sense. People of other races have to submit themselves to arbitration and the impressions of a small group of empowered perceivers to gain access to the social landscape. One thing in these examples is crystal clear. The outcomes don't actually have anything to do with the types of language being produced. Accentedness doesn't place genuine limits on the ability for civic engagement. These arguments are about race and class and are made for a singular purpose, the preservation of a dominant worldview, one which leans towards the preferences of those who have been in social control over time. And for most of written history, the individuals in social control have been able-bodied, male, Christian, white, and moneyed. It is their relativistic and egocentric perspectives which frame our stories, which set the value for the exchange rate for the linguistic material in all of our linguistic markets. During the 18th and 19th centuries, these empowered actors were in control of material knowledge production across the globe. And while we unfortunately do not have time to get into the textual side of these phenomena of standardization, although please do ask questions about it, it is these same actors and actions which give rise to the standard variety of American English we have today. Ideological and even productive alignment with a standard variety is not uncommon. In fact, it is highly common. In other areas of the globe, however, we find the standard variety is typically that of the largest population center in the country. Take the King's English of Britain or Parisian French as canonical examples. But in the United States, a different variety of the standard, a suburban, whiter variety, a variety of American English that followed waves of xenophobia away from the immigrant-rich population centers of New York and Philadelphia to settle in the inland North dialect region becomes our standard. This region is circled in blue here and extends across New York State, up over Pennsylvania, across Lake Erie, up into Michigan and beyond. Over time, the use of this variety becomes seen as the proper thing to do. It becomes associated with all the good qualities the powers that be have spent the last century defining and aligning and setting up institutions to protect. Qualities like appropriateness and sincerity and innocence and on and on. More than this, not using the standard variety by choice or through some failing of physical or mental ability is seen as an indicator of lower intelligence or a difficult or sometimes even criminal nature. And because this inland North variety, what I'll now refer to as white standardized spoken English, enjoys institutional support through its use in all formal, creative, and technical writing, in courts and across professions, assimilation to this variety is required for social mobility. And while it is perhaps already clear how social mobility can threaten people in certain bodies more than others under these conditions, I'd like to provide another example before continuing with our consideration of how people labor in contemporary linguistic markets. Likely one of the most important cases of the modern era in terms of social justice with respect to legal precedent is Mendez v. Westminster. In the simplest terms, a group of parents sued a California school district to have their children, who were of Mexican descent but considered members of the white race, removed from a school for children with special needs where they were placed for speaking Spanish. The parents were successful. It's a good outcome, but we'll focus on the argument the court makes for allowing integration of these groups, which is that through their segregation, the Mendez children and others like them were being denied exposure to English, and that through this, quote, commingling of the entire student body, which instills and develops a common cultural attitude among the school children, which is imperative for the perpetuation of American institutions and ideals. The courts are prioritizing this common cultural attitude, and that lets us know that they were aware of language's power for social construction here. They are aware that national ideals, that the belief systems which uphold our markets could be weakened if populations like these remain unintegrated. And so the issue facing the courts really isn't about these children learning, which they would be able to do in these separate schools that did present material in a medium of instruction more accessible to them than in the mainstream system, albeit through inequitable means. It is about the education system producing adults that can seamlessly assimilate into American institutions. Without taking the time to get into specific examples which demonstrate how the education system has come to prioritize a specific and homogenized means of standardized communication, this example gives us at least a shared understanding of what the longtime priorities of the government are for the output of federalized education. We've considered a lot in a brief time: material knowledge production, the creation of race on a national scale through legal means, the reinforcing of those divides through anti-literacy laws and naturalization proceedings, and the workings of an institution such as education, reinforcing negative stereotypes about non-standard language users. I could go on speaking to you about every institution there is, about how the media has been saturated in racialized language and images since its inception, about how race-based linguistic stereotypes contribute to a rising mortality rate for Black women in healthcare, about how lack of access to standard language translates into more on-the-job deaths for certain populations, or more of my research, which indicates that negative ideologies about Black speech aid in the maintenance of housing segregation. But what's important to recognize from these brief examples of institutionalized linguistic oppression is that Black language users find no quarter in our built environment, no matter what variety of language they are producing. Through the processes of education and socialization, we see some language users being marked as less than. And this allows other institutions and individuals to treat them this way as well. Again, focusing specifically on the Black community, sounding Black in adulthood, allowing the obviousness of the body you live in to be present in the way you use language, becomes a marker of all these negative connotations like low intelligence and laziness, because the education system should have fixed you. It should have given you the tools for removing signs of non-standardness, and in this case, signs of your race, from your language use. If you can't, or you choose not to, this failure to meet a listener's expectation lies with the individual producing language. Perhaps they lack a willingness to engage with you or the ability to produce what you expected. What I am describing are what sociolinguists and other researchers refer to as deficit models. And they are part of the way America does business. And they require certain individuals to always be working in some sort of way to get around what their body means to other people. My research into Black professionalism essentially begins here, with a recognition of the relationship between deficit models and institutions and the inherent relativism in embodied perception and production. Let's take a few refreshing steps back with an illustrative example. A handful of people are engaging in a conversation. Each of them exists in a different body. They all have different ages and races and come from different places. All of these language users choose their utterances, perhaps producing some type of greeting. And what is being weighted, the value between variables for the user, their exchange rate in the emergent context. is to an extent predetermined by the structure of this market, the now containing space, where the dialectic moment of social process occurs. Imagine that this interaction is happening in the back of an Uber. Hey, what's up? Now it's a courtroom. These contexts shift the range of greetings available. But perhaps for some users, the greeting they normally reach for would fit both settings, or would need to change the least to fit expectations. The extent to which someone can exploit the range of expectations available in a given context is mediated entirely by embodied positionality. And this is the foundational observation which underlies Flores and Rosa's concept of ratiolinguistic ideologies, which tell us that there exists an association between certain bodies and linguistic deficiency, which exists no matter how these individuals are producing language. In consideration of linguistic markets, we can imagine them as where commodified sociolinguistic labor is taking place. Sociolinguistic labor is defined by Holiday and Squires as the physical, emotional, and psychological effort put into deploying sociolinguistic resources in a way that is meant to satisfy others. Sociolinguistic resources are linguistic material, which has utility because it, like all material, possesses specific properties, aspects that distinguish it from other material and thus make it appropriate to meet certain needs. Like all forms of labor, sociolinguistic labor has the power to produce more value than it contains. This outcome results in part from the development of a globalized economy that values homogeneity. And please do ask me more questions about that later. Bourdieu describes the linguistic market as valuing material based on an established norm, a standard of production, which serves as an exchange rate. In Zhang's study of Beijing professionals, this exchange rate is the production of modern standard Mandarin. A user in these markets does sociolinguistic labor then to tell a joke or gain professional advantage, inhabit an identity, participate in some other act of being. Depending on their embodied proximity to a standard language user, they may have to do more or less work. Their exchange rate may be adjusted to satisfy their needs or to meet their stated ends. Again, echoes of relativism. User A cannot tell the joke in the same way as user B. Bourdieu describes the linguistic market as a structure which imposes itself as a system of sanctions and censorships, but that style, like how we do stuff, derives from the ways in which a perceiver, the listening subject, makes connections between how differently embodied people navigate those sanctions differently. A final point to consider is the overall topic of Weldon 2021, and that is the specific linguistic challenges that are faced by upwardly mobile Black individuals. We've come to understand that linguistic markets value more standardized linguistic production. Weldon's work captures the very real struggle that middle-class educated Black adults have after encountering the demands of many markets where their labor is amplified compared to other people around them, like I'm doing more work. But despite engaging wholeheartedly in the actions of talking proper that was drilled into them in youth, Weldon's work also demonstrates that Black people are not merely signaling their race when they're using language, but that there exists a full spectrum of racialized varieties the African American community orients to, and not only on the informal or vernacular end of the spectrum. This widened spectrum of variation is one aspect of usage I wish to capture from Black professionals to develop a broad sense of the ways in which individuals who carry considerations of sociolinguistic labor actively, consciously, in their daily practice conceive of the fullness of their linguistic repertoires and how they might describe their style shifting practices as a group. In general, I am interested in theorizing around the differences between the audiences users imagine and the audiences that exist. For example, I spend time discussing self-censorship practices with each interviewee. They tell me what parts of their language they leave out of their workplaces and who they are afraid of hearing those features and why. And then in a subsequent perceptual experiment, I analyzed perceptions of those features to determine if people had the reactions the interviewees were anticipating. So let's take each of those aspects of this work in turn. In the first weeks of 2020, I was motivated to begin developing a regularized means of capturing metalinguistic commentary on linguistic experiences from a population who shares a given set of identities. Metalinguistic awareness has been considered in the Western canon since Aristotle, but the definition I offer for it is the aspect of acquired or learned linguistic knowledge, which encompasses factors related to language use, knowledge, distribution, meaning, or occurrence variance. What do we know when we know a language? Well, we know how we use it. We know how we use it. We know how we use it. We possess a knowledge of a vast set of rules for how utterances can and do exist in the world. The MMSI contains 7 sections and, not unlike a Libavian interview, progresses the interviewee through stages and tasks which are geared towards eliciting different and increasingly richer types of meta-commentary. For this first application, I designed a protocol to elicit commentary on 5 key social factors, as well as other aspects of variance individuals could be expected to comment on. The dissertation contains a report on the discussion of targeted terms section, 3 thematic reports across sections and interviewees, 3 case studies, and a perceptual experiment. I interviewed 17 self-identified Black professionals from Detroit, 7 men and 10 women. And if they felt it was important to tell me about their sexuality, I felt it was important for me to tell you about their sexuality. 5 interviewees worked in the education sector, 3 in the nonprofit sector, with Yolanda running her own national nonprofit. The other 9 interviewees came from different professions. Sasha is an entrepreneur. Chance founded his own law firm. I truly wish we had time for me to tell you about each of them, because they are all just spectacular humans, but instead I'll present some findings. The case study of Simone focuses solely on examples of sociolinguistic labor across her career trajectory. Simone when she noticed a Black woman years her senior who had a very energetic personality and was great in the room with donors, but was often relegated to menial tasks, even manual labor during public events. When she inquired with her supervisor, she was told it was because this woman had poor grammar in her email added in other areas. And she decided to protect and project this colleague's intelligence by getting her some training. But these kinds of courses can only help so much. So Simone ended up bringing this individual the rest of the way there herself. To aid this individual in transferring her ideas into a style they could be received through by translating all of her emails into the standard. What a profound act to do for another person, but what tedious, difficult, and burdensome sociolinguistic labor to take up every day in service of another as well. Across these interviews, sociolinguistic labor is revealed as something done to satisfy the self, like when Black professionals do the very hard work of incorporating their racialized varieties into the practice of their professions. Excuse me, as Chance called it, seasoning. And in the service of others as well, as we've just seen with Simone. But most interviewees also report the types of sociolinguistic labor we might expect. Assimilationist labor, engaged with due to psychosocial pressures, which have convinced Black professionals that using their racialized varieties can cause them to be viewed as deficient, abnormal, or unofficial in some way. And so they are moved away from to ensure the individual can be seen as a viable source. What remains for us to discuss is, are they successful in making that movement towards more standard varieties and attempting to obscure their identities? I designed a speech perception experiment to engage with these shifting practices directly. The main goal of this study is to determine if Black speakers are successful in conveying their professionalism when features of their racialized varieties are present. In each experimental trial, listeners hear a pair of sentences only presented orally and choose which sentence sounds more professional, sentence A or B. In each sentence pair, listeners hear sentences that differ in the number of non-standard variables. I chose these variables because interviewees cited them as aspects of their racialized styles they shift away from in the practice of their professions, or in the case of Day, 90% of interviewees cited this feature as indicative of Detroit speech, so it's highly regionalized. There were 3 between subjects conditions tested in a fully randomized design, followed by a diagnostic pair that was presented last to all 300 listeners. Here are the outcomes for that diagnostic pair, which established that the overwhelming majority of listeners across all demographic categories reliably choose that all standard sentences more professional sounding. So the sentences, we knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options, and we can see that most people prefer the version with ask instead of acts. The set 1, the next version, is the other 2 variables under study. It's arranged in the same way. The sentence comparison task where we saw before, where a listener chooses sentence A or sentence B. This could have appeared in any order. Before the diagnostic pair, we just saw the results for. The listeners, so here it's a group of 150 per sentence, are choosing between a standard sentence, which I'm going to play for you in a moment. Those are the blue bars here. And the other 2 variables under study. So Day for TH stopping, or Trent for consonant cluster reduction. So let's hear them.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
That's your standard sentence.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options. We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
And we can clearly see the blue bars are bigger. And this outcome holds regardless of the order people receive them in or where set 1 appears in a given trial. Listeners appear to readily choose the all standard sentences more professional, and that holds reliably and robustly across all of these variables. So set 2's purpose then is to take away that all standard sentence and ask if this effect is cumulative. If there's nothing fully standard to choose from, which features are the more preferred? It's clear from visual inspection of this data that the general trend that we observed in set 1 is upheld. The blue bars stay bigger in all conditions. The outcomes from these 2 variable sentences, though, are not the same when they're paired with different single variable sentences. In the interest of time, I want to focus on the most distinct outcome, which occurred with the Day plus Trent double variable sentence, which I've circled for you here. I'm going to just quickly play a sample of that double variable sentence so you can get a sense of what it's like. Maybe.
We knew they might ask about a new trend in stock options.
So you can clearly hear there's 2 non-standard variables there. You heard the other sentences just that it's being compared with just a moment ago. Visually, we observed these outcomes to be very different, but listeners heard that exact same sound file I just played for you, but in these different groups, they made really different decisions because the red bars aren't the same size. It would seem that the single variable sentences they are being compared to have different effects, that perhaps Trent is more non-standard than Day, But to measure the outcomes for these between subjects conditions, a generalized linear model was run in R, which predicted the likelihood that listeners would choose the sentence with more non-standard variables, that they filled up that red bar. And these statistics show us, in reproducing the pattern depicted in that raw data, that listeners are significantly less likely to choose the sentence with trend, with consonant cluster reduction. And that tells us that consonant cluster reduction is a perceptually heavier feature of Black accented speech, that it's generally dispreferred in this population over TH stopping, like over day. So day is like not as bad as trend. The effect is cumulative. All those blue bars are still taller, but the relative professionalism of these variables is not the same in this context. So two non-standard features worse than one, but they're not all the same. So set 3 then is designed to more closely assess the relative professionalism of the 3 variables under study, and finds that while the general trend is still present, people definitely disprefer them. All 3 blue bars are still longer, right? None of these variables behave the same. So before we were testing a cumulative effect, this is a comparative condition. We have a sentence with one variable being compared to the other 2 variables under study to look at how they operate in concert. What we find is that the salience of acts is so strong that in set 3, it has a blocking effect in that listeners are as likely to choose the 2 variable sentence as professional as they are to choose the 1 variable sentence. This outcome suggests that listener stereotypes about acts were activated. Listeners are being asked to weight acts against the other 2 variables in terms of professionalism, and the results indicate the 100 participants who received that sentence pair that's been circled here were split in their judgments. When those same participants were part of that first group, the 300 people who got the diagnostic pair, and they were asked to decide between ask and acts in terms of professionalism with the all standard sentence, their choice was strikingly not in favor of the highly salient, Black indexed, and non-standard, deeply stereotyped speech feature. So there's something different going on in this condition for those listeners. All 3 variables from the speaker, however, are dispreferred in this context when they appear in isolation, and some more than others, as we've now seen. Understanding why TH stopping, the regionalized feature, isn't as harmful to perceptions of professionalism will take more work. And if folks want to ask about that, I certainly have thoughts. Overall, these results that tell us that professionalism judgments are reliable across all of these demographic categories indicate that Black professionals are unsuccessful in conveying professionalism when features of non-standard racialized varieties are present. It would seem then that Black professionals do indeed need to engage in style shifting practices in sociolinguistic labor, which moves their linguistic production away from their racialized varieties towards a more standard one to be perceived as more professional sounding. That if they choose to sound more like themselves at work, their identities as professionals are more likely to be rejected by audiences. We know from years of sociophonetic research that listeners are very rapidly attending to social information in the speech stream, and that influences their linguistic choices. And I didn't manipulate social information directly in the experimental design, as is often done, but that precise socio-indexical source of the information that led to a listener's percepts doesn't matter, because Lebovidal's claim about the operation of the sociolinguistic monitor holds here, because we know that perceiving a single non-standard variable has as much weight as it does in their study. It can have a maximum impact on percepts as well. Even though I didn't give you enough detail to make this clear, overall, my findings demonstrate that assimilationist sociolinguistic labor is thriving, that it is preferred among all groups of listeners, even those which align with the interviewees in this study, which claimed that they never code switch and don't intend to as professionals. both because they actively resist standardization and because they think better of their fellow man. It would seem that both the optimist and the pessimist, at least in the younger generation of Black professionals, are headed towards burnout and disillusionment, but that is perhaps a different conversation. Some other revelations from this work are what is currently driving my curiosity forward on this project. Something very interesting to me was the ways in which most interviewees were able to provide very detailed accounts of how, when someone of another race enters a context, the meanings that are available or that they feel comfortable producing change. That is, again, revelatory of the vast set of rules we have for how utterances are deployed, and not just by ourselves, but also the communities around us, and demonstrates the mental work, the sociolinguistic labor involved in keeping those feature sets active at all times for some language users so they can respond at a moment's notice if needed. Additionally, it demonstrates that the perceiver controls the linguistic market, but that it is a specific type of empowered perceiver who determines the exchange rate of all variables, even variables they do not possess, understand, or command. Additionally, especially in discussions of the meaning of specific terms, it became clear that many users have extensive metalinguistic knowledge about terms they do not deploy. This isn't particularly surprising. Everyone knows the meanings of some words they rarely use, but traditional methods of sociolinguistic interview, even participant observation, hasn't regularly captured such knowledge. Theorizing around the linguistic material we don't use but know very, very well will also help answer the calls Babel and King raised for subtle models of social interaction and a broader conceptualization of individual beliefs about linguistic behavior. Lastly, I want to offer some connected themes for where my research is headed generally and discuss what I'd like to see in the study of African American languages overall. And I'll preface this by reiterating that I am a classically trained sociophonetician, probably the biggest sound nerd you'll ever meet, and 100% wrote a dissertation about speech. My intellectual curiosity is seated in the voice and how it functions in the mind and world, and I find no fault in others who also seat themselves in the core. That said, the method I developed addresses one of the more stark issues of inequity in linguistic theoretical development, and that is phonocentrism. The study of speech has been prioritized over the past 50 years in linguistic inquiry at the expense of all other forms of communication, not only over other forms of linguistic structure. Many linguists and language-related experts from other fields, such as speech pathology, maintain the belief that speech is the only viable and acceptable form of languaging. And this has palpable consequences, not only in our theory, but in the wider world for language users. This matters for considering the ways in which language users could and should be interviewed about their language use and the parts of their linguistic production worth analyzing once they've shared their experiences with their whole bodies in front of whatever recording equipment they've consented to. Deficit models of language use have been created by and through traditional variationist approaches. Sociolinguistic survey methods were initially developed in part to address what was viewed as underperformance by Black students in urban school districts, contributing to deficit models by delimiting who was Black enough to interview about African American English and what counted as examples of racialized language from a set of previously described so-called vernacular features. Although the intentions behind early sociolinguistic work in large urban Black communities may have been altruistic, what resulted has become a decades-long campaign on the part of Black linguists and Black people to defend the validity, uniqueness, but not exoticization, and heterogeneity of Black language and the agency and creativity of its users. This campaign was and is necessary because Black people experience linguistic discrimination every day due to its weaponization of language across institutions, which has the cumulative effects on personhood, agency, social mobility, and community development. In this light, what I would like to see happening in the future of AAL studies, no matter what type of linguistic material is being considered therein, is a centering of Black community members in the production and reporting of the work. Many researchers take such efforts with Indigenous people, but in fact, we should be taking such efforts with all people. And in my opinion, work on linguistic variation that is not meaningful engaging with or reporting the perspectives of communities it is researching should never be accepted for publication moving forward. Now, every study is not embedded in a community, but every study in our field is analyzing language, and you can't make language without a body. What that necessitates then is a concerted and purposeful recognition of the bodies and beings which provide us with our data, regardless of our research question. My dissertation also introduces a model for representative and inclusive demographic surveys that can aid us in capturing more information about our participant populations. And it is my hope that every single study for the rest of time will report full demographics of its participants so that we may always learn as much as possible about the phenomena we research, and that the fullest extent of the scientific method may be realized as our theory develops through generations of replication. It really is just about prioritizing language users. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions. Thank you for providing me with this space. It has been really lovely working with you.